About a year ago on our channel, we published a video about a trick on how to prevent your orchid from dying. This was intended for people without any experience and for people without any additional expenses to spare for the maintenance of their orchid. We showed a quick, easy, and cost-effective method of reanimation which is widely used. In trying to show this method, we simply created millions of other questions, concerns, and misunderstandings arising from our customers and viewers. And so, this gave me the idea of conducting an experiment with orchids, because when a customer purchases an orchid, the first question they typically ask is, will the orchid bloom again? And if it will, what exactly needs to be done in order to achieve this goal? With this experiment, I will try to answer these questions. But before we show you this experiment, I would like to tell you a quick secret. The problem is not all sellers and growers are at all interested in the fact that your orchid should bloom, survive, or live at all in your home after you've purchased it. For the past couple of years, the market price for orchids has dropped significantly, and orchids have become a very common plant. And for example, in Ontario, you can purchase orchids at virtually any supermarket. This affordability and accessibility brought the orchids from the status of a collectible plant to just a simple potted plant like the poinsettia, which after the holidays will sadly end up in the garbage. This is why the main purpose for orchid growers and sellers is to just safely deliver the product from the greenhouse to the seller to your home. And so they pack orchids for sale just to save space and to make it convenient, comfortable, and efficient during the transportation. We usually receive orchids in the packing trays that you see on our table before you. This I call the basic survival condition necessary to make this transportation likely. As a result, orchids can only survive on the shelves of stores for only a couple of months. Some growers use bark for the substrate and some growers use moss. With varying substrate, we tend to encounter different problems. When it comes to bark, we receive orchids with dry air roots because bark doesn't support the moisture orchids need for very long, and so they dry out faster. When it comes to moss, we receive orchids with rotten roots, like we showed you in our first video. This is due to excessive overwatering. Growers typically want to sell you the orchids more and more frequently, and this is all done to maintain the business. That's why after buying orchids, it is your responsibility to create a condition in which the orchids will feel comfortable and happy. If you leave orchids the way they come in when you purchase them, you have a very high chance that your orchid will die. And let's face the truth, our homes are simply not tropical environments as you would find in Southeast Asia, and our humidity is far from the essential 80% every day. The temperature by your window depends and varies upon the season, and the duration of our daylight hours are always changing. And so we cannot maintain the regular 12-hour daylight like they have in tropical countries. As such, we are going to discuss in more detail on how to properly care for your orchid, and we will talk a little bit about this experiment. After receiving 17 orchids we purchased on sale in mid-September, they arrived to us in full bloom. And so we cut the stem towards the top of the leaves in order to prepare a bridal bouquet. We transplanted the orchids using the method we showed you in our first video. And for the substrate, we used sphagnum moss and a 6-inch non-transparent pot with plenty of drainage holes at the bottom. The sphagnum moss was collected and prepared by us. All 17 orchids were placed in a condition which our average customer has in their home. The temperature varied between 23 and 25 degrees Celsius, and the humidity jumped from 40 to 70%. The window was facing the southeast corner, and there was no additional lighting or mineral fertilizers used during this time. Normal watering patterns were maintained, and no additional expenses were involved in this experiment. Today is December 12th. 3 months have passed since we have begun. Before we start to discuss the results, I'm going to briefly explain to you why we use moss in our experiment. Growers typically only use moss to grow young orchids from seeds. Moss is widely used to save orchids without roots. Moss has a property for that purpose. The slightly high acidity which is present in moss is just right and essential for orchids. Moss, after all, is what surrounds orchids in nature. Another property of moss, and this one is quite important, is the way that it absorbs and maintains moisture. Also, antibacterial factors found in moss are widely recognized and known. In essence, moss is simply a unique organic fertilizer due to the way moss naturally contains lots of dead organic matter from decaying particles of plants, leaves, grass, small branches, and so on, which naturally occur in moss. All of this decaying matter provides the orchids with the nutrients that the orchid needs. And so, now we're going to look at the result. As you can see, the orchids look healthy and happy. No parasites are present, and for 3 months, these orchids have given at least one new fresh leaf. 6 out of the 17 orchids are preparing to bloom, with one already blooming. The ones that are preparing, as you can tell, have spikes with buds. And the blooming orchid had begun to bloom as soon as we cut the stem. And so you're going to ask why 40% of the orchids are preparing to bloom but 60% are not. There could be 2 reasons. One of them is that the days are simply getting shorter, and from September to December we lost at least 3 hours of daylight. So it is possible that there is insufficient lighting. Another reason, which I think is the main reason, is that some orchids need a resting period after blooming. I call this the growing period. During this period, orchids intensively grow leaves and roots. From many years of experience, I have noticed that orchids have a leaf-to-roots ratio, and orchids must be in a state of balance before they prepare to bloom again. If orchids lose or are depleted in biomass of leaves or roots, this biomass has to restore itself in order for it to get in balance and start blooming again. This all depends on what kind of mistake was made in previous care, and orchids might lose roots and leaves and therefore biomass due to rotting or drying. Orchids need some time, maybe a few months, to themselves return into proportion. I'm pretty confident that the 60% of orchids that you see here will start blooming by February or March. And in conclusion, we can say that orchids that are in balance can essentially bloom almost non-stop and give flower shoots almost immediately, even sometimes multiple flower shoots. But some orchids need a rest period after blooming in order to restore and grow additional biomass. Organic fertilizers are especially crucial in that period, and therefore it is always better to change your substrate once in 6 months because it degenerates very quickly. The longest time I've had blooming orchids was 6 months, and our orchids typically bloom twice a year. In other words, flowers last 2 to 3 months, and then the resting period begins and lasts for 2 to 3 more months, and the cycle repeats. Sometimes orchids need a shock to start blooming, and what this means essentially is a temperature change signals a seasonal change. In order to stimulate this temperature change, you can simply move your orchid from its normal condition to an area of lower temperature and then return it back. This is what always works for me if I'm interested in triggering the blooming process. And so I encourage you to experiment, to analyze, compare, and use our advice wisely. Once again, and as always, thank you for watching and good luck.